Dear guests, good morning. We are glad to hear of that you have arrived um, with great numbers to this in human rights um, conference. You're most welcome to this 7 decades since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights conference with Muwatin. First, the president, Dr. Abdul Latif Abu Hijla, will make a speech. And remember that there is translation service. So if you need any translation, you can go get the kits. Also, there are some materials and publications outside from the last decades with regard to human rights, um, citizenship, and other kinds of laws. Also, there will be an exhibition about human rights by Ziad Izzat, who will present this and will talk about the direct and indirect colonization and their negative impact on human rights. Also, the right to entry campaign will be discussed and supported by this conference. This is a popular campaign to promote the human rights of Palestinians suppressed by the Israeli occupation. In these 2 days, we will talk about human rights locally and internationally. We will also listen to a number of important intellectuals and activists, such as the president of Birzei University. Um, this important place for human rights in Palestine will always promote this. I now call Dr. Abdul Latif Abu Hijla to inaugurate this conference. Good morning. Dear attendees and dear guests, it is my pleasure to welcome you here in Birzeit University and to inaugurate this conference. Birzeit University sees itself as an important body inside the society which calls for development and prosperity with the promotion of independence and freedom. Here we also always speak about various important subjects that um, promote important societal aspects. This conference is proof that we are keen on this subject. We constantly aim to achieve what we aspire for, with while calling for freedom and providing a way to achieve these different uh, goals. We listen to the popular voice and the local and international um, opinions. Um, so human rights is a very important consideration in Palestine. We work consistently to um, provide academic and political support for this. We tackle this in an integrated manner in order to be able to confront the various obstacles and challenges in the face of the occupation that we are living in. I would like to welcome all our guests from outside of Palestine who have come to participate alongside us after 7 decades from the International Declaration for Human Rights. 7 decades have also passed since the Nakba, the catastrophe of 48, displacement, war, poverty, imprisonment, and other catastrophes. It seems that the timing was important 7 decades ago. Um, Oppression and poverty and other humanitarian tragedies have continued for 7 decades since then. Yesterday, there was another conference where there was a discussion of the international law, which talks about long term occupation or occupation as a permanent status instead of something interim. Um, we have great trust that we will overcome this through science and through uh, solidarity. Uh, since the last 20 years, or for the last 20 years, I have worked as a deputy chief of academic affairs in the university. Dr. George Jackaman was the director of higher studies at the time, and I was having a discussion with him. And so someone asked a question: how can you teach people about human rights if you cannot even defend your rights? He answered that we always aspire to achieve our main mission, which is to promote human rights, regardless of uh, what happens, to aspire consistently. Human rights has been tackled by various conventions and agreements. There are there, however, there should be certain mechanisms which help in implementing human rights in Palestine in the coming foreseeable future. This conference is an important one, uh, where we do not take things for granted, but we keep looking critically at things in order to achieve the various objectives related to human rights. Hence, we must talk about Palestine from the wider context of the developments all around the world, in order to diagnose this particular human rights aspect, or these aspects in the best way. Human rights violations are taking place in different aspects, and it seems that there is a lawlessness that is prevailing, um, where different even in United Nations there are aspects of uh, forcible threats. Now, for example, also we have guests who are unable to enter the country because of the wall or Gaza, or other policies by the occupation, where the Israelis prevent or deny permit visas to enter the country, into Palestine, in order to promote human rights. Um, we constantly tackle human rights aspects, and we understand the different violations. We call for dignity for all human beings. Uh, um Despite the disappointments that we have in our country, and despite the silence regarding the occupation, we still believe that there must be a better future that achieves rights through solidarity and struggle for human rights on the global and Palestinian levels. Once again, I would like to welcome you here. Um, I wish you great success in your conference, and we look forward for your contributions, hoping that these 2 days will see great discussions and good conclusions and outcomes. And we also hope that these will pave the way for new discussions pertaining to this subject. Peace be with you. Thank you, Dr. Abdul Latif, for this um, kind and great introduction. Since the establishment of Muwatin Center in Birzeit, or Institute in Birzeit University, um, conferences have taken place through this institute. Sorry, um, our we still have a long way to go. Now I call for Dr. Mudar Kassis, the director of Muwatin Center for Human Rights, um, to speak. Good morning. Firstly, allow me to welcome you to the 24th conference of Muwatin, and to reaffirm the important vision of Muwatin in the role of the society in cultural life. We see the society just like the land, that the society is the start and the outcome, the road, and also the aspirations. I would like to share with you some of my concerns about human rights. Today, we are living in an era where humanitarian um, aspirations are being destroyed because of the various catastrophes, such as the two world wars of the last century. However, modernity has reached its peak, and it seems that it has become self destructive. And uh, so sometimes um, bad scenes have taken place as a result of that. So, with regard to the Vienna Convention, for example, there has been uh, outcomes in tackling aspects. The feelings of defeat have taken place under the force of neo-imperialism, who try to get away with the various violations and the use of double standards, and where there is the pushing of the rope towards the direction of those who are powerful to serve the interests of the strong. So it seems that might is right according to some. So this pulling of the ropes is not a new thing, but today we see that the different forces are wrestling together. For example, Israel has been uh, trying to stand against the UN many times in terms of its violations and so on. And recently, we're seeing the United States to do the same thing to challenge the UN. And so, neither Iran nor Iraq during Saddam nor Northern Korea uh, did launch a campaign against the UN. That's because they didn't see themselves like a lion in the forest. So um, the assault or offense against international legitimacy is not only by withdrawing from conventions or not um, joining them, but there are kinds of attacks against international legitimacy when we see that there is a constant um, disregard of these rights. Rights are seen as if they are a product in the hands of the powerful. And so it, this has become as if a business between different forces, where parties provide economic aid at times and humanitarian aid at other times. Look at today, the right of Palestinian self-determination has become um, sorry, has become only under the condition of their peacefulness, or to stop any resistance against the occupation, and different other conditions, such as Palestinians to accept a racist apartheid state, or any or their acceptance of unfair agreements. So these are inalienable rights, and it seems that like the strong are calling for Palestinians to give up things that are very important. Um, in the last century, we saw how the Cold War was a main thing which was calling parties to combat. Uh, Human rights were being focused, but at the same time, shortcomings were taking place under Thatcher and Reagan, and the gradual transformation of China into the capitalism that we have in China today. We see the neoliberal era taking place. So this era saw um, a problem out of modernity. So, so the modern times have been abused in a way, and um, to, today we see certain legends that we see where humans are creating, but the real essence is not there. There are two main uh, rhetorics or discourses in human rights. The first, the two are like the two faces of one coin. The first one has to do with the writers of the texts, and where they have different intentions behind the texts, including the text of the International Declaration for Human Rights. For example, Charles Malik. I want to stop here for a minute. Uh, he was the only Arab among the publishers of the International Declaration for Human Rights. Charles Malik was an Arab and very strong supporter for human rights. He asked from the United States during a speech that he gave in a secret event. We don't know when it took place. The CIA published it about 1991, so it was probably 1951, because the CIA usually publish after 40 years. It was probably the McCarthy project, which was anti-communism. During his speech, Charles Malik asked from the United States um, to accept or play a leading role given to it by God. And after that, he asked for the American military intervention in Lebanon, which actually took place in 1958. US Marines went down to Lebanon in 58 to protect Lebanon, so called, from the Pan Arabism and communism lines or dangers from their point of view. And afterwards, they were asked to stand with the Kataib, the Phalange, um, where they would stand with the Lebanese front, which was allying with Israel and was racist. Uh, However, the United States was writing about its Declaration of Human Rights at a time when blacks were had to sit in the back of the bus, and they were, of course, not allowed to sit in the front of buses. Therefore, there is no need to be, you know, no need to believe the illusions about defending human rights, because we must first understand the intentions behind any declaration. As for the second discourse or rhetoric, it is the rhetoric that we know very well in Palestine. It says that the declaration and its results has have supported the rights of those who are oppressed by foreign hegemony, and um, this rhetoric has called for international solidarity with the Palestinian people, and brought legitimacy to the Palestinian liberation struggle, and the declaration and recognition of the rights of the Palestinian people and their self declaration, which are inalienable rights. So the International Day for solidarity with the Palestinian people was declared as a result of this discourse. So, about 30 years since the partition plan, 1977 was when the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people emerged. Also, the second discourse talks about concepts such as equality and justice and social uh, justice included. So, we see that, of course, different ideologies have um, become more powerful in Palestine. The more we, the more we alienate ourselves from being a state, the more we see violations on personal human rights. Therefore, human rights have become an important deterrent of the intentions and aspirations of powerful forces which aim to colonize or manipulate or enslave, even. What I would like to say is that there is no doubt that there is some hypocrisy in those who signed this declaration. Uh, However, we see this declaration as an important one, uh, and technically, the essence of this international declaration and its related conventions and agreements do have positive effects. This declaration is not only the importance of this declaration is not only in its text, but it is also in the rights which we can preserve by ourselves at the end of the day. These declarations cannot be effective except if we adopt that within our Palestinian project. And they also need adherence. In the sessions of this conference, we will talk about concepts related to human rights, as well as their political impact and the ways of using um, these concepts to serve freedom and um, to promote human rights amidst the various complications, such as political and historical ones. We also call for breaking the monopoly of strong, rich countries which violate human rights many times. So, um, as is the case in previous Muwatin conferences, um, the Palestinian context will be discussed strongly. This event which is the 70th anniversary of the International Declaration of Human Rights, is very important, uh, as important as the 30th anniversary since the declaration of the Palestinian state. However, my fears are related to the following. One, the symbolism of the International Declaration of Human Rights. Two, the symbolism of the declaration of the Palestinian state. And three, the symbolism of uh, the memorial of that. So this is related to mythology and ideology. Um, so we must decide whether that we are recipients of human rights or creators or makers and supporters and initiators of human rights. I see that this conference will not be based on preaching as much as uh, being a forum for implementation. In these 2 days, we will talk about the reality and future of human rights based on our particular needs, um, in order to formulate a system that supports our freedom in Palestine and the freedom of all the world. So, in all cases, there is no need to cherish human rights without cherishing the human being, him or herself. Therefore, the human being lies in the essence of this, and we always call for human dignity, and this is our main launch point, if you may. Thank you, Dr. Mudar. Yes, this is a quite rich and full conference. It will discuss Palestine and the international scene. Um, in this geographic small location, we always aim to be effective. We also aim to be decision makers and not only recipients. Um, Dr. Bettina Marx will inaugurate this conference. She has tremendous experience in the Middle East. She is directly the director of the Heinrich Boll office since 2015. Heinrich Boll is the organization which is supporting this conference for the 24th time. Dr. Bettina Marx will now speak about the human rights in the policy of the European Union.
Good morning.
صباح
I
الخير.
want to welcome you to this conference,
أود أن
and
أرحب
I want
بكم
to
في هذا
thank
المؤتمر
Muwatin to give me the opportunity to
وأن
address this distinguished
أشكر
audience today with a
مواطن
few
لأن
thoughts
أخاطب
about
هذا الجمهور
the
الرائع
human rights and
مع
the
بعض
role human
الأفكار
rights
بالنسبة
play in European foreign policy.
التي تلعب دورا
Almost
في السياسة
exactly
الخارجية
5
الأوروبية.
years ago, on the 3rd of
قبل
October
3 أعوام
2013,
تقريبا
a ship
عام
carrying
2013
African refugees from
سفينة
Libya to
تحمل
Europe sank off the Italian coast near the island of
لاجئين
Lampedusa.
أفارقة غرقت، كانت قادمة من
360
ليبيا.
people died, among them many
لقى
women and children.
360 شخص
A few
حتفهم.
days later,
وبعد
another ship
أيام عند
appeared,
جزيرة
also
لامبدوزا،
off the coast of
وبعد
Lampedusa,
أيام من ذلك
resulting in the death of
الغرق
34
للسفينة.
refugees from Syria.
أيضا
These
تأثر
two incidents
34
caused an
لاجئا
outcry
لقوا
in
عطفهم
Libya
وهم
and civil
قادمين من
societies all over
سوريا.
Europe.
هذه القضية
People were
آه،
enraged and saddened by
جذبت
the loss of
انتباه
life and
الناس
aimed
في
to think of a
الإعلام
united Europe
والمجتمعات المدنية،
progressively closing
وهم
in on itself and turning into a fortress.
أن لاقوا
European
حتفهم،
leaders
وكذلك
went to Lampedusa
كانوا
and paid tribute to the dead
خجلين
and
مما
vowed
حدث،
to never let it happen again.
لأن
This was 5 years
قالوا
ago
أن هذا
only.
لن
Today,
يتكرر أبدا.
private German ships who
هذا
sailed to the
كان قبل
Mediterranean
5
in
أعوام.
order to
اليوم
save refugees
السفن
from
الخاصة
drowning are more
الألمانية
in the ports of
التي
the southern European
تجوب في
states.
المتوسط
Crews
من
were
أجل
forbidden
إنقاذ
to save the lives
غرق.
of
هذا
desperate
الغرق هذه
people
خسارة
who try to reach
الأرواح،
safety and prosperity.
وكذلك لأن
One
يكون
German
ناس
captain,
هم في حالة
Klaus
يأس.
Peter Reich,
كلاوس
is
بيتر
even
رايش وهو
accused of
قبطان
aiding the
سفينة
migrant
ألماني
smugglers,
آه،
and he has to stand trial
اتهم
in Malta.
بأنه
One
يساعد
of the large and
المهربين
liberal German
وهو
newspapers published a
يتعرض
front page
للمحاكمة في
article
مالطا.
under the headline,
وأحد
Should we not
الصحف
better
البريطانية
not
قالوا
save them?
هل
And accused
يجدر
human
بأن
rights
لا
activists
ننقذهم؟
of poisoning the
وأن
climate
قالوا
in Europe.
بأن منظمات
One has to
حقوق
ask,
الإنسان تقوم
is this
بتسميم
division of
المناخ في
Europe
أوروبا.
based on the rule of
فهنا
law,
يطرح
on democratic
السؤال:
values,
هل هذا
on dignity
يعكس
and
أوروبا
compassion?
الموحدة
And if
التي
like me,
تعتمد على
you
قوانين
are a European
الديمقراطية
citizen of the
والقيم،
older generation,
الكرامة
then you will ask
والمحبة؟
the question,
وإذا
is
كان
this the
هناك
Europe
مثلي
we envisioned?
ممن
Is
هم
this the Europe my
أكبر
generation
عمرا،
and the
هل
generation of
هذه
my parents fought for
ما
after the Second World War?
ستتمخض عنه
And in
أوروبا؟
view of the
هل
disaster
هي
and
أوروبا
destruction
التي
that our
تقاوم من
continent
جيل إلى جيل
experienced?
حاربت في
Still,
أعقاب الحرب
only
العالمية
at the
الثانية
beginning of the millennium
وحالة
things looked
الدمار؟
promising in Europe.
وهذا
In and the
الدولي،
European Union
ومن
its
أجل
further action
الترويج
in the
للتعاون
democratic service
الدولي،
of the
وكذلك
EU
تعزيز
is explicitly
الديمقراطية
based
وحقوق
its
الإنسان
policy on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights
واحترام
and on the
حقوق
European
الإنسان
Charter.
والحقوق الأساسية،
On the
وكذلك
homepage of the
أن
EU
هنالك
you will read
الخدمات
the following
الدبلوماسية
statement.
الواضحة
Guided by the values on
المنخرطة
which it is
في
founded,
آه،
the EU is committed to a
ميثاق حقوق
rules-based
الإنسان،
multilateral
وكذلك
international order. The Union
المواثيق
regards the respect
الأمم
for and
المتحدة،
promotion of
وهذا
international law,
موجود
including
في
the principles of the UN
وهنالك في
Charter, to be crucial for preserving
الالتزام
peace,
بالقوانين
human rights,
الدولية في
sustainable development,
النظام
and
الدولي
lasting
المتعدد
access to
الأطراف،
global commerce.
فإن أن يكون
In
هنالك
June
تعزيز
2012, the
المبادئ.
European
وفي
Council agreed on a
حزيران
strategic
2012
framework
وافق
human
الاتحاد
rights and
الأوروبي
democracy
حول
that is
إطار
designed to
استراتيجي
make
حول
EU
حقوق
human rights
الإنسان
policy
والديمقراطية،
more effective and
والتي
consistent.
تكون هذه
In the
السياسات
document
أكثر
drawn up by
فاعلية
the representatives of the member
ومساواة.
states, we read the
وفي
following.
الوثيقة يجب أن
The
نقرأ
European
ما
Union
يلي:
is founded on a shared
الاتحاد
determination
الأوروبي، وأنا
to promote
أقتبس،
peace and
هي
stability in a
متأسسة
global
على
order founded on respect for
التصميم
human rights, democracy, and
الذي
the rule of law.
نتشاطر به من
These
أجل
principles
الترويج
underpin all
للسلام
aspects of the
والاستقرار،
internal and
وأن
external
نبني
policies of the European
هذه
Union.
المبادئ
Human rights are
تغطي
universally
السياسات
applicable
الخارجية.
legal rules.
فحقوق الإنسان
Democracy is a
هي
universal
ذات
aspiration.
طابع
Throughout
أممية
the world, women and
وحسب
men
القيم
demand to
المتبعة.
live lives of liberty,
فهذا
dignity, and
التطلع
security in open and
للديمقراطية
democratic
الأممية
societies
في
underpinned
جميع
by
أرجاء
human
العالم.
rights and the rule of law.
يريد الناس أن
Sustainable
يعيشوا
peace,
بحرية
development, and
وكرامة
prosperity
وفي
are
مجتمعات.
possible.
ديمقراطية وحقوق
Also, in
الإنسان في جميع
2012,
أرجاء العالم.
the EU appointed
وكذلك
its
عام
first ever
2012
EU Special
عينت
Representative for Human
الاتحاد
Rights,
الأوروبي
Mr.
ممثل
Stavros
خاص،
Lambrinidis.
هو مستر
His role
ستافروس
is to make
لابرينيديس.
EU policy on human rights
دوره
in
أن
non-EU countries more effective
أن تكون
and to bring
أكثر
it to public
فاعلية
attention.
في الدول غير
I have to
المنخرطة
admit
في
that I never
الاتحاد
realized that the
الأوروبي.
EU
يجب
has
أن
such a
أقر
position,
بأنني لم
and I once hindered a boat with international activists to sail to Gaza is fulfilling this role since 6 years. As far as I know, he has not traveled to our region and not tried to bestow on Palestinians and Israelis the lofty principles of the European Union. So let us examine the policies of the EU on the ground. For example, on the contested ground of the Palestinian
البدو
More
المقيمين في
precisely,
منطقة
الخان الأحمر.
في حان
The EU
الخان
has
الأحمر
repeatedly stressed
تحديدا
that it will
البدو
use the
المقيمين
destruction
هناك،
of the village and the displacement of its
فركزت بأن
inhabitants
تدمير هذا
great
وتشريد
danger. The
السكان
European
هي
Parliament has denounced Israel in
في غاية
September
الخطورة.
warned that it would be committing a war crime
راح
if
الصوت،
it demolished the village. In a 320 to
الصوت راح
277 vote,
راح
the
الصوت
parliament in Strasbourg approved a resolution against Israel
ها
that called for
راح الصوت
budgetary
عفوا.
compensation for
هلا
financial
رجع.
losses should
في
Khan al-Ahmar be
في
demolished.
هنالك أن يكون
European
هنالك
Union Foreign
تعويضات
Policy
لخان
Chief
الأحمر.
Federica Mogherini warned Israel of serious consequences if the
ففريدريكا
ideas
موغريني
demolished
راح الصوت
Khan
كمان
al-Ahmar.
مرة.
As repeatedly stressed, the consequences of a demolition of this
وأن يكون
community
هنالك
and the
راح الصوت
displacement
كمان
of its
مرة.
residents, including children
فتبعات
against
ذلك
will, would be
بما في
very
ذلك
serious and
الأطفال،
would severely threaten the viability of the two-state solution
بأن
and
يكون هنالك
undermine the
حل
prospects for
الدولتين
peace.
والتي
Mogherini said.
تقوض احتمالات السلام
Okay,
كما ذكرت
this sounds a little bit
موغريني.
more decisive than many
يا
other
زلمة
statements we have heard from Brussels. But what will happen
هذا يبدو ذات تقرير، ولكن ما سمعناه من بروكسل. ولكن ماذا سيحدث حينما تقوم بتدمير خان؟ هل هنالك من يعتقد في هذه الغرفة بأي طريقة عدا عن الشجب والتعريب عن القلق؟ هل ستكون هنالك إجراءات عقابية ضد إسرائيل؟ هل ستسبب هل ستجمد اتفاق الأفق لعام 2020 نهاية الاقتباس؟ بالطبع لا، فإن السياسة الأوروبية هي بعيدة المنال من حقوق الإنسان والديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان. على العكس كليا، فإن كل أوروبا تقوم بشجب بربط بالتحول بعيدا عن الحريات في فلسطين. حينما يدور الحديث عن فلسطين نلاحظ عملية تراجع الانتقاد إلى إسرائيل، فإن الصراع ضد قضية المقاطعة وفك الاستثمارات والإجراءات العقابية، وكذلك نتخلى عن حريتنا من حرية التفكير. أوروبا تدعي بأن سياستها قائمة على مبادئ محددة، ولكن هل هذا صحيح؟ لماذا لا يقوم الأوروبيين بمطالبة الحقوق بحق الفلسطينيين؟ هذا الصمت المدوي بنظر أغلب الناس بأنه ليس هنالك القتلى غير المسلحين الذين يلاقون حتفهم. لا نسمع عن أين مسؤولية الحماية الفلسطينيين حينما يتم قتل القضاء على الأطفال الفلسطينيين. فمن الواضح بأنها ليست ملتزمة بالقيم التي ترفعها، ولكن بمصالحها. ليس هنالك أكثر فائدة من الاستفادة من التكنولوجيا الإسرائيلي وصناعة الأسلحة من زاوية، ولكن من خلال التخلي عن القيم التي تدعيها حينما يدور الحديث عن الفلسطينيين. برأيي هذه ليست مسألة بسيطة. الأسس التي تقوم بها هي في خطر أن تتقوض. في نهاية أود أن أشكر مواطن لتنظيم هذا المؤتمر المهم. أيها الضيوف الأعزاء، أنني أمل بأن يكون هذا مفيدا والتحديات المطروحة أمامنا في خلال هذين اليومين. Thank you, Dr. Bettina, on this word that shed the light on important aspects of this conference. With this, we conclude the preliminary speeches, the opening. So we will come to the first session, which will be chaired by Dr. Islah Jad, and we summon the participants in the first session to the podium. Welcome. Uh, we will start the first session with three participants. صوت واطي. We will start with Dr. Raif Zrikh, who is well known. He is a member of the academic staff in Haifa in the Karma Academy, and he's academic director, participant to Minerva Institute for Humanities, uh, human rights, and Dr. Raif Zrikh will speak about the dark side of rights, and he has 20 minutes to go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. In order not to waste time, I would like to delve directly to the subject. I would like to thank Birzeit University and Muwatin Institute for organizing this important conference. Um, my the subject of my lecture is the dark side of rights. My lecture is not too dark, if you may, but uh, I wanted to talk about the dark side of rights for a reason. Usually, there are some things missing when it comes to rights. There is no doubt that after the Palestinian experience, after Oslo Accords, where there was the pragmatism and political relations, it seemed like justice was being spoken of as if justice was only for those who are powerful. Um, there was a need to bring some balance after the rhetoric of power, the discourse of power. And so there must be more of a balance in such um, relations. I see an importance of talking about rights in this aspect. This is the first point. The second point is that in the last 200 years, this speech about law was related to rights, but the philosophy of morality has failed to talk about itself without the rights. In short, there is an imperialism which is in charge of the rights today. The discourse of the imperialist approach. Today, we all have other languages of expression, the language of needs, and so on. But the language or texts related to rights put aside the needs and other important aspects. The objective of this lecture is to talk about how to avoid more problems in the language of rights, and especially in UN frameworks. When we look in the texts of the UN, many times we just look at the things that we like in them, but we sometimes forget that the UN adopted the Balfour Declaration and the partition plan, and it was the 242 and 338 of the UN actually accepted the remarcation of the partition plan. So we must know that human rights are not only being used by us, but it is many times used against us. As Dr. Mudar said, he has spoken about the uh, double language or double standards. Um, we see a binality in the language of human rights. I would like to start by talking about human rights from this point of view. In 2002, an activist friend of mine who is from a from an organization that supports Palestine, she sent me a part of a questionnaire which asked me, or yeah, asking people, have you ever been to Palestine and so on, that you have to be this passionate about Palestine. In order to be part of Human Rights Watch, you must be impartial, must be, yes, impartial or objective. This shows us a certain image or approach in human rights. This was a time when the Palestinians were in a fight for their land, water, and air. So, in human rights language, we saw um, that many times there is a binality. There's a model that says that human rights is an objective thing which is not subject to any dispute, in the sense that it is different from politics, that human rights is above politics, and that the political disputes must be resolved from the Olympus point, which is based on human rights, since it is the adjudication point in deciding regarding political dispute. So it seems that that is the moment of consensus. Human rights is the moment of consensus that decides, that it is a point of consensus despite all the disputes that we are different from socialism and capitalism, but that we must all agree on human rights. Therefore, human rights has become a subject to to teach, or subject of study. That is the approach, that human rights is above everything. The people who were working in the political field before 1990 had a different orientation. After 1989 or 1990, we have seen a development in the language of human rights. Even though we saw that in 1948 there was the Declaration on Human Rights, this subject was not as important as the period after 1990. For example, in the 1970s and 80s, there were international struggles going on, struggles against occupation and struggles for liberation, which were first uh, influenced by Marxism and then Franz Fanon, some of them. But these orientations did not speak about human rights. They were based on the struggle, and that proletariat is not subject to any compromise with capitalism, and that the third world will kick out the colonizers. That was the main language. We cannot adjudicate the disputes from point one. That was the emancipatory thought, without any middle points. We must get rid of the colonizers and kick the oppressors. That was the main orientation then. So there are people who look at these systems in an overlapped manner. Sometimes they prefer one over the other, and sometimes the opposite. So there is the liberation project and the human rights project, especially after 1990, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in a non-violent manner. Um, Human rights orientation won over the other one, the liberation one. After the Cold War. By the way, I'm not a revolutionary person, and I was not involved in the Cold War or with any side. But all that I'm saying is that there was there were many emotional feelings about that. It was more seen as an emotional thing rather than some other orientation. There are, of course, some points that undermine the whole project. These are two different systems, as I said, related to human emancipation. The first one is disputes and conflicts, and the second one is based on consensus. The first on subjectivity, the second on objectivity. This is an open question that I do not have the answer for which I do not have an answer. Uh, and so these are big subjects. The binary points are discussed always in each country. The right to express one's opinion or the right to assemble. What do we mean by them? When we say the right of opinion, means it means that you can be with the settlers in Israel or with the Palestinians in Israel. The freedom of or right of opinion is in a way to kind of stop disputes. What is the right of ownership? It means that I want to have ownerships, that I am free whether I want to rent it or to sell it or to just keep it. I- If I'm in Australia and I have 1,000 dunams or acres, for example, and my neighbor wants to pass a cable over my land, I have the right to tell him no. Why? Because of this right. Therefore, if you have a certain right, it means that you do not need to give answers for certain things. These are holy rights, if you may. And it also, so despite the moral aspect, such as, for example, rejecting someone's passing of a cable through your land, it could be that someone would not have ethics, but you have the right to be unethical. Why? Because you can say, no, you cannot pass that cable through my land. I just used this as an example. And so, um, therefore, the left does not necessarily have a disagreement with the rights. Rights can definitely be utilized and invested even by the left. In the US, for example, the whole rights based approach started in the 1960s, the civil rights movement among African Americans, and as well as the feminists and environmental movements in America. However, these rights were also promoted by capitalists. But in the beginning they were saying, how can you say take my slave away from me? This is what the slave owners used to say. But then they would come and say, you cannot pass any publications in my factory. Also pharmaceutical patents, the same thing. You are allowed to prevent millions from receiving medication just because of your patent. So sometimes rights can promote immorality or unethical behavior. So if we look at the US history, it is seen that there was the focus on the right of property to promote also the rights of employees. Later, they became the liberation movement. However, the last 20 years, what we see in the States is the neoliberals taking power, and not just power, but also in shaping the whole thing. There is no contradiction between the left and the rights. And I also see that there is no disagreement between the goal of third world countries to become liberated and the rights from and the rights. So if I receive a number of rights, I am not obliged to give those rights to others. So the poor have a need to eat or learn, of course. That is a need, but it is also a right. However, rights are sometimes limited. There is a constant struggle with regard to rights. The beauty of rights is there is a certain binary thing or dichotomy. Now, this is also related to psychology. The beauty of the idea of rights, and Saeed would like this. Hey, Saeed, rights as trumps, as one of the uh, philosophers said. Trump in terms of the cards, of course. Rights are trumps. I mean, in terms of the cards, like when you play cards, you do the trump. So when you do that, it's like this is only yours to take, and it's not some anyone else's. You cannot put rights to a minimum level, or to cut them down to different pieces. These are inalienable. So you cannot really compromise the rights many times. The minute you start compromising rights, the whole idea about the rights becomes, in a way, weaker or undermined. If you ask any person or any person, whether they're a lawyer or activist working in the field of rights, they would probably agree with that as well. This is quite clear. Why? First, because rights are relational. My right is your duty. There is someone who is paying for the right. My right to privacy, or the right to not to declare what I said to the advocate or to the psychologist, shrink, for example, because if you violate a right, someone will pay the price. So is a price for rights. Hence, rights. Um, yeah, for example, the right to self-declaration is that I have the right to close my border and not to receive any refugees. Look, I mean, it can be unethical, but that is the right. I am Bill Gates. I have $6 billion, and if a child from who came from Ethiopia and hit my car, I will have him pay $1,000. I can put him in jail. I don't care. My whole idea is that no one can interfere in my affairs. That's why there is overlapping and conflict in rights, in the rights of people. I'll give you, yeah. So the the moment of the exceptions in the in any conventions become problematic. If you see some items or clauses putting exceptions, that undermines the rights themselves. All the conventions end as such. They put exceptions to the rights. So countries use pretexts of that thing. Therefore, these exceptions undermine rights, and rights simply become interests. This is a dichotomy that is related to the various binary or dichotomous points. How much more time? 3 minutes. Okay. I would like to stop here. Can I use my 3 minutes for question and answer? Before putting any more minds here, um, it would be good to answer questions. I thank you a lot. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you, Dr. Raed. Zek. Now, the next speech will be, or lecture will be, Dr. Raja Bahlul, who has worked in Birzeit University in the past. Um, he's a professor of philosophy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, formerly taught at Birzeit University's interests and publications span the areas of metaphysics, social and political philosophy, Islamic philosophy, democracy, and human rights. He will talk about the universalism about human rights.
It became very clear that speaking of rights, there is a black spot, which is the sort of monolithic aspect. The issue that I will address is the universalism. What we heard makes a lot of sense, but it is not the whole story. The idea of the theoretical aspect of human rights and not human rights in practice. This is the space that I will try to address, that I'm familiar with. Maybe I'll speak about another aspect, which is the positive aspect, not only the theory in itself that leads to cover this aspect, but to have the proper common sense. It is not something that we can deny. My question that I will address, is there something to speak about the universalism during this era, where you have the specificities culturally and the mobilization? This is the paradigm of referring to it. And the aspect that I will cover is, yes, it is possible to defend the, the universalism of human rights from maybe a moderate or rectified sense, that we do not give up for the Western, or to give up to the stereotypical kind of definitions. The issue of dignity and human rights is based on a basis of universal, fundamental, and common features that rotate around respectable life. maybe we don't agree fully on a definitive definition about the human nature, but we are not, totally ignorant of such a request, where this request is a humanitarian common aspiration, where there is no disagreement about the universal dimension of human rights in isolation of Western or varying degrees. We don't want to refer to the background and history and why we have to be critically reviewing it. And I will not defend either about the response. Maybe we will tackle that during the question and answer. Human needs in relation to human rights. The Universal Declaration has 30 rights: civilian, political, uh, biennial, and
يعتقد
essentially
أنه حاجات
linked,
أو مصالح
which is interest
طبيعية
or natural
تلزم.
interests that people can live in dignity, emanating from that if there is a disagreement about a certain right, that this will be referred to what is in the text. This has to do with the varying nature. Of course, it's relative with the humanitarian requests that vary here and there and related to the culture to see the credibility or otherwise with the Universal Declaration of HR that the right of dignity with liberty to stay safe from any that you cannot have arbitrary kind of attitudes to have proper health. All these elements are for sure linked with human needs that are natural, that people want to give with dignity and which is not subject to question. Whatever you call it, these are different aspects from life, human rights, and regardless of their ramifications, how it is interpreted within a certain economic aspect, where you have absolute human rights that are not subject to see whether it is the dark side or the grim side anyway. Also to think of certain requests that we do not dream that are not rights, and where there are points of divergence, and to have the request basic for people to be right. We don't say to every person the right to have a doctorate, but the right for education and no need to have a doctorate, but to have a respectable in this age. He should be alphabetic. There must be a theory which is presented as needs, but they are not rights, not locally or globally, although many people consider it important, but they consider this essential to have a dignified, that there is one day a night might require a black pair of shoes or the right to have caviar. Such things are essential to many people for sure, but it has nothing to do with human rights because we have to have a respectable pattern of life. And there are many other things that we challenge. There are certain rights which is democracy is a right for public life, which is 22 items. Other rights could be imply that living in a secular system could be considered a human right, and the ability to change and express opinions in religion, for example, without undermining other aspects, that you live in a society where there is a special halo around religion, say some kind of secularism. There are texts that require democracy, and there are points of divergence where people disagree upon are questionable. So, according to its imagination or respect, it doesn't require isolated the rights that can Twitter with. This is like what we heard from Raif Zreik. Where you have it in a consistent way. That it was never Marx when he spoke uh, the human rights and the citizen. This is the right of people to be selfish, maybe. These critical points have been there for a while. My story, I do not want to be deterministic and have a final say whether it is secularism or democracy or individualism. These are among the rights. This is an endless kind of uh, that there is connected, that it is a human need, that is urgent and a genuine one. Or if we agree that it is a right, it has to do with the insistency. That's my opinion. If we look at the rights that we have a section that there is something in common among all walks of humanity, where there are basic elements that pivot around respectable life, where it starts with the right for food and living and relative liberty that people can live with dignity. And after what is in common with all people, you have the white aspect. There is another framework. In a nutshell, my response that human rights, yes, are universal and otherwise. As much as there is a basic for human needs that are common and not point of divergence, regardless of you say specificity of the value system in society, but after there are points of contention. So it is not universal and it is open for disagreement. Speaking about black and white aspects that everyone has the right of nutrition, the, regardless, these are not questionable, undebatable. That I do not prevent people to pass from my land or to take it, some money, the, the right of property, uh, the, the bread you have the right to eat. This is not a question which is for debate. Selfishness and excessive individualism, this is all there. They are adversarial. We have seen it in the competitive capitalistic system. But we should not forget that there are basic common needs that are global and should not be subject for question. But where you have a schematic, theoretical kind of aspect that have to do with emotions, this is what I have to say about to what degree the rights are characterized by universalism. Thank you.
The last speaker will be Dr. Hassan Khalil. Dr. Awesome. Is Vice President for Community Affairs and faculty member of the Department of Law, served as Dean of the Faculty of Law and Public Administration, and the Director of the Ibrahim Abu Lughod Institute for International Studies at Birzeit University. He will speak about the following: human rights in Palestine and globally, a shifting concept in a changing world. Thank you very much. In the beginning, I would like to speak in an informal manner to just talk about the main thing that I will talk before starting my lecture. I will talk about the change in the or the difference in the concept of human rights. The difference between how countries see that and how the courts, whether constitutional or international or what have you, look at this subject. So the idea is that the human rights concept can be seen differently from one side to another, whether by academics or in the public debate or in the courts. These are not differences on the right itself, but how the right is understood to start with. After the Second World War, there are two phenomena seen. There is the process of legalizing and documenting human rights through international agreements. These agreements started emerging more and more after the Second World War, and different mechanisms of accountability were introduced. There is another thing, which is that after the Second World War, many countries started aiming to have a written constitution which clearly specifies the freedoms and rights, and where there is or are courts which do monitoring. Of course, there is or might be an agreement or disagreement on how we analyze or understand these rights. So the governing systems uh, could sometimes have inconsistencies. They could even become Nazi or fascist systems. So that's why we must understand how we can put a certain framework to govern countries in the best manner. So, as a result of this orientation, which has been reflected on the international scene and also in the courts, there is the understanding that there are some basic rights which I will talk about today. By the way, some of the things discussed by the previous speakers have are similar to what I will say. Four assumptions here. The first uh, assumption is that the basic rights are absolute rights. This is the first one assumption. Just like saying that some uh, rules are non-compromisable. Some rights are uh, compulsory for all, and so on. Also, there are some negative civil rights, uh, because sometimes countries abuse their authority and start intervening in the affairs of citizens, and so sometimes countries copy the laws of other countries. So technically, they take from the laws of other countries and introduce them in their constitutions. They call this gardening, as if you're bringing a plant from different gardens. You go to this garden, you get this plant, and then from this other garden, put another plant in your garden. So that assumption is that basic rights are absolute. The second assumption is that human rights only produce negative obligations, meaning that if the countries do not must not intervene in the rights and freedoms because this is not their job. So the countries, it is seen that the countries have a negative impact on rights. That's why we call our countries not to intervene. That is the second assumption. So this is the second assumption which we must overcome. That assumption says that the country shouldn't do anything, and I disagree with that. Of course, um, the third assumption is that the uh, obligation is vertical and not horizontal. That the country must do things for transportation, for the educational sectors, and so on. So that assumption says it's a false assumption. Of course, it says that the thing is only vertical and not horizontal. As for the fourth assumption, which was, by the way, discussed before by previous speakers, the fourth assumption says that the rights are implemented only in normal situations, um, and but can be broken or undermined in states of emergency or state of necessity. This assumption says it's okay, we can practice the rights, but if there is a state of emergency, then the rights can be violated. This is the fourth assumption that must be overcome. In literature of constitutional comparative studies, they discuss this aspect. A discourse is there by different authors. Uh, there has been a study of the implementations of different courts with regard to these four assumptions, but the main assumption on which the international theory for basic rights says is that there is a certain kind of problem in basic rights, but that in some courts, inconsistency in human rights. That's in some instances, courts see something as a basic, holy right, if you may, but it wouldn't be such an important right, and sometimes they consider a right which is not that important as important. So both in Palestine and in many other countries, inconsistencies in looking into the different basic rights. For example, there is a basic right of not allowing people to walk their dogs on the shores of Gaza. This was introduced by Hamas government. So isn't it a right to walk with your dog on the coast, on the seaside? Is Don't we have a right or basic right to have education in Palestinian universities, regardless of people's economic situation, rich or poor? Don't we have a basic right of feeding birds in public places? Why does that violate human rights? This has been discussed by courts, in courts, by the way. Is it a basic right for homosexuals to practice their sexual orientation freely? And don't they have the right to have the government accept their marriage, same-sex marriage? Don't Do we have a basic right not to record one's religion on the identity card? And don't we have the right to have a passport without the need to have a consent from another person? Don't we have the right to have civil marriage? Do we have the right to have a divorce if we are not happy in our marriage life? Do we have the basic right of deciding our religion or changing it? Don't we have the basic right to have a suitable place to live, or the basic right for people from who have a different color and so on in different countries? I see that all of these subjects were discussed by courts and were considered as basic rights at times, but at other times they were not seen as basic rights. So we see that in the same time, uh, one country would consider it a basic right, but another country would not consider it a basic right. This is just an introduction to the four assumptions which I am discussing. The first assumption says human rights are absolute. No, the answer is human rights are not absolute, but they are subject to the differences among countries. In the international theory of human rights, we see that. By the way, we will perform a case study for Muwatin regarding these four assumptions to discuss them and delve into detail with regard to them. The first point is that there are basic rights that do not appear as basic rights. So these seem to be basic rights in the very beginning, but then there are rights that might not appear as basic rights in the beginning, but they truly are basic rights. So if, for example, they are related to freedom, dignity, equality, and so on, that we mainly say that this is a basic right, but we must wait for the courts to decide whether it is a basic right or not. And it is also based on the constitutional law at times. The second assumption is that the basic rights do not necessarily produce negative obligations. Sometimes they actually have good outcomes. Many of the basic civil and social rights necessitate the intervention of the state to to intervene in order to bring about justice, such as establishing courts, um, and giving protection to people, giving them the ability to reach the courts, and so on. So it is not only a negative obli- uh, obligation, but a positive one as well. That's the answer to the second assumption or obstacle. As for the third assumption, which says that the basic rights do not produce only vertical obligations, is wrong because basic rights also create horizontal obligations and not just vertical ones through the state and so on. So, in other words, these rights do not only oblige state or government actors to intervene, but also all parties within the society must intervene in the practice of um, basic rights. In Palestine, for example, instead of having the courts um, take the lead in supporting basic rights, we have seen that the Supreme Court of Palestine has many times retreated from considering the basic rights as mentioned in the basic right as binding. They retreated from considering these laws binding. We see sometimes that the Supreme Court does not really care about the Sharia courts, and sometimes they rely their judgment on the military courts in Palestine, since the military courts have been issued through the PLO, and sometimes the Palestinian Supreme Court or High Court relies on the Jordanian law. So we see some inconsistencies in the Palestinian higher courts approach with regard to basic rights. As for the fourth and most important assumption, which claims that human rights are not uh, absolute because they are only implemented in normal situations, but there are exceptions. It is a wrong assumption. This necessitates the balanced approach that we have mentioned before today. We must remember that other people also have rights, and not only certain parties. So you have your rights, but there are other people who also have the right to disagree, for example. Sometimes people have the right to live, but they do not have the right to ownership to the place or in the place where they live, since they're not the owners. So there is an imbalance that is seen many cases, uh, and there is a lot of relativism used in that. in the countries which really respect human rights, we also see that these countries see that the state has the freedom to organize things in the way they want, and many countries actually violate human rights within the framework of organizing the country. Going back to Palestine, the Palestinian law and the basic law and the unified constitution and the basic uh, rights and freedoms in Palestine have uh, tried to limit the country and defend the citizens from the state. In the basic or the Palestinian basic law, we see many indicators that show that we are that the PA is not different from any of other system or government in the last 100 years. After the Second World War, we see that people can also go and file lawsuits against the government, especially after the defeat of Germany after World War II. We have learned from the mistakes of others, um, fellow countries, and so rights and freedoms have been taken into consideration, have been spoken about as an absolute thing. However, the problem lies in implementing these rights. For example, how the president and the legislative council and the courts will implement. So the implementation is the problem. Some people think that the court is an activist or a leader in achieving the rights in order to bring about a balance between countries in hand in hand with the public benefit. However, the problem is that the Palestinian Constitutional Court is not able to pass the test until today. We are currently writing a paper about the importance of having the courts uh, work more towards implementing rights hand in hand with the international human rights laws and conventions. Thanks a lot for the three speakers, our lecturers. Now we have the chance for a good discussion to be engaged, if you may. Uh, send some bombs in this in this hall, if you may. He said how the concept of human rights carries its um, different aspects. Also, Raja talked about the natural rights, and Asim said that the rights could be relative. They could mean different things in different places. So this is the main ground for discussions. Now we open the chance for the speaking for the public to ask questions. Please avoid long comments. Thanks a lot. Good morning. Ammar Dweck, Independent Commission for Human Rights. With regard to Mr. Raif's lecture, and tomorrow I will speak about this subject. We see sometimes an inconsistency between human rights and international law. International law has different faces. It reflects the hegemony of major forces and powers. As for the human rights, they reflect the desire of the world for peace. So international law reflects the desire for hegemony, and the human rights reflects the desire of the world for peace. It seems that there is inconsistency. Mr. Ammar, tomorrow you will have the chance to speak a lot about this in the roundtable discussion at 2:30. Yes, but my question is this. You said that rights are not absolute. However, there has been great development in the jurisprudence pertaining to human rights. Has been a discussion about what is absolute and what is non-absolute human rights, and things that talked against hate speech and what have you. In Australia, for example, and that rights are inalienable and so on. For example, sick people have the right to live and so on. Therefore, there is a very complicated network of human rights, if you may. And so there is a lot of jurisprudence which talks about this subject. Lots of literature by the UN as well, UN literature which discusses this subject has been tackled. Is it working? Yes, okay. In the rescue of human rights, do you think that your attempt to rescue human rights can avoid the occurrence of grave mistakes in human rights? Or if we are going to devise rights through the natural needs, can we avoid having big fallacy, natural fallacy? My Arabic seems to be weaker, he says. So, can we avoid the natural fallacy? And the question to Dr. Asim. In the case of Dr. Asim, can we isolate between the rights and the policy of the state? As Dr. Raif said, um, is it relative or non-relative in politics and economy? Or do we have to be always governed by having this human right thing as a product of the state? Good morning. Just a direct question. Yes. Samir Hijazi is my name. First question to Mr. Raif. You were talking about the right and then the law. What is the difference between the right and the law? What do you think is stronger, the right or the law? And also, when we talk about freedom, there is a parable which says that my freedom ends when your freedom starts. Yes, the freedom of others. Uh, the question, another question. And now to Dr. Raja, you talked about the generality of the human rights law, but I would like you to link to that to who wrote that. Who wrote it? The hegemony or the technically you were saying that there are human rights, but who wrote these rights? Those who want humanitarianism or those who want hegemony? And the third question to Mr. Awesome, you talked about the courts. Do you think that there really is a separation of powers or not, or separation of authorities? Shall I take two more questions, or do answers and then get more questions later? Okay. My question is to um, my name is Mahmoud Ziadeh. My question is Mr. Raja regarding natural rights and basic rights. This is from the theoretical point of view, but it seems that in practice there are neither natural nor basic rights on the ground. And so, how can we have these rights be implemented on the ground? After that, without practicing these rights, how can we ever look at them from a positive point of view? Jalal Rumane, released released prisoner, yes, and a specialist in Israeli studies. Many times there are trials. Israel tries to show the leftist Israeli political parties as very evil parties. For example, the with revocation of Israeli citizenship from Ilad, who was the head of an Israeli uh, organization, a human rights organization. What do you think about that approach? That in Israel there is the breaking of basic rights. Sameh Zruzli from Najah University. Question to Mr. Awesome. The fourth assumption talks about restricting rights. In Al Najah University, we talk about this subject a lot. Um, my question to you, and it's related to the previous question about the separation of authorities or powers. Um, or yes, or electronic crimes. Yes, decree law about electronic crimes had some violations of human rights, and so I would like you to specify what are the states of emergency in the Palestinian predicament. And many times it seems like we are living in a constant, permanent state of emergency where the government intervenes in everything. Another question is, what is the role of the third authority? It seems like we only have two powers and not three powers. The legislative power is limited. How much does that affect us when we talk about human rights in Palestine? Thank you. Peace be with you. Iyad As-Sarraj. I am always study and look into the violations perpetrated in Palestine. I also suffer from that. All of us suffer from it. But what's your question? What? How can rights be implemented? How can I gain my rights? Sir, do you have any question, please? Amidst the disagreement about the concept of rights, is my right lost? This question was for to Mr. Raif Zrek. Amidst the disagreement about rights, is my right lost? Mr. Salah? I highly praise the lecture of Mr. Raif. It was great. It seems that there is another rule which talks about the controls of these rights. Don't you think that you have exaggerated in your explanation? For example, you were talking about the cable and like not allowing people to pass through your land. But there is another law which says the right of passage. So doesn't that person who is passing his cable through your land have the right of passage or right of connectivity or what have you? So countries have different rights, and so there should be a certain kind of balance, don't you think? Are you? Yes, he works in the legal field, a lawyer, seems. Hello. My question is to Mr. Raif Zreq.
هلا انت حكيت او وصفت الخطاب تبعك اللي هو الوجه الاسود
You
زي ما انت حكيت انه هو الوجه
you were saying that it is the dark side of rights, but I think that it is the real and white side.
فانا سؤالي هل في هدف انه احنا نحارب بشيء
So
الاسنس تبعه ابيض لانه انت ذكرت فريق
it seems like these rights are racist in a way
فليش
that they were put by the white man.
هذا
Um,
ليش ما نطلع
so
على حقوق الانسان زي كيف ماركس اطلع على
shouldn't
الانسان
we look at the at human rights like Marx looked at capitalism?
مظبوط
He didn't try to fix the corruption of the state.
هل ممكن انه
No,
نعمل
but he came up with something new. Don't you think we should look at it from this point of view instead of just coming to try to fix it? Ibrahim Kalalwe, master's degree student from An-Najah University. Question to Dr. Raif about the right to self-determination. Uh, of course, there is the right to self-determination, but that right could have us lose the right of return. So, don't you think that is the case? Another question: don't you think that some countries abuse human rights by some loopholes in the law? Question to Dr. Hassan: the absolute basic right, can it be overcome um, by some parties
احنا بدأنا
in a legal manner?
مؤتمر بدأنا الجلسة هاي متأخرين تقريبا
We started this session a bit late by
وطالب
12
استبدال
minutes,
يعني دقائق
and I
لكي يتاح
ask
المجال أكثر
to
للمتحدثين
extend the
للإجابة على
time for
الأسئلة
this session
الموجودة
so
في
that the
القاعة.
speakers would be able to answer the various questions. Now I will use the 2 or 3 minutes that I didn't speak in. All of these questions motivate me to think more about these subjects. I didn't say that there is only a dark side of rights. No. What I meant to say that it has at least two faces of rights. Sometimes the etymology of an expression could kind of show us the base of something. In Arabic, al-haq and al-haqiqa, which mean the truth and the right, they could be used in an interconnected way. In English, you say right and right, like you are right, but then you have the word right. So there are linguistic aspects too in expressions. However, in certain times of history, truth has become a private thing. Rights have become under the ownership of people. For a long time in political thought, rights and duties were not even foreseen, in the sense that no one thought that you can ever come to the judge and he's doing the right thing. And so the preservation of the right is based on the relation between the two sides. For example, you couldn't in the past come and claim your right. However, at a certain point of history, individuals started seeking rights as well. Um, so the rights of individuals have been enhanced, and the right of people to even ask religious questions and doubts, and then doing the right thing and having the right was seen clearly in the 17th century. Doing the right thing and having the right, so the word right. Until today, however, in the Palestinian case, we we tend to be more emotional, and we confuse between the I have a right and this is the right thing. We tend to forget that this is a personal point of view. I still have not been assigned by anyone to see things from a different angle. The min the minute the minute we had subjectivity where I have a right, freedom became the main moment of rights. This is the moment in which natural rights have been divided from natural law. These are not the same thing. For 2000 years, it was natural law, which was based on obligations, commandments, and how you must behave. These were only based on obligations and not rights. But then the minute rights became the main purpose and the main aspect, where you have the freedom to choose to be evil or good, this became a transitional and important thing. You have the right now to be stingy, for example, or the right to have a piece of land where you can prevent anyone from passing through it. This random thing or arbitrary thing has been very positive, I think. But there have been negative things from it as well. No compromise and so on. Many times we confuse between having the right and doing the right thing. Think about this. I cannot, of course, answer all the questions that were posed here, but I think most of your questions are linked to this answer. For example, if I see Marxists, I can be liberal. If I see liberals, I can be Marxist. If I see liberals and Marxists together, I can become a nationalist. So if I'm under Al Assad law, I would definitely call for the separation of powers and all the rights and so on. I would call for all the human rights system. However, it, it could be that after that system takes place, you don't know where it could lead. Maybe people could become poor, or we can become like South Africa, where we think we have solved it, but then the whites have the wealth in South Africa and the blacks don't as much as them. So it could lead to new problems. I don't want to talk about cynicism here, but it's a way of, uh, you know, problem of approach. As you said, I am afraid of everything self-evident, and that's because if in the first political battle we see that things are not self-evident, we as Palestinians have lost various battles and arguments and disputes because we thought that Palestine was self evident for us and that there is no need to rewrite the whole struggle in a detailed manner uh, uh, alongside the Jews. Do, can you believe? You would not believe what someone just came up with. The world is passing through an Israelization process. It's like the moment of exception, and they're transforming cruelty into a natural thing. There is a person who is not very smart. This is a Christian Jewish conspiracy against Islam and immigration. They are saying that countries have the right to preserve their majority, that the majority have rights, they're saying. When? When the majority feels that they are in a feeling of weakness, or that because the majority is becoming under threat, like the countries next to Russia, where in Moldova, for example, you have many Russians and so on. So the Palestinians inside the 1948 areas are not allowed to enjoy being a minority. They want to have all the power of the majority materially and even the ethical power. They're not even allowing us to have the moral right. They're coming up with theories that say that the majority have the right to technically all have all the power. So don't you think that this is unfair? You would like to tell them the word and then off, if you know what I mean. You must come and say nothing is self-evident. Therefore, we must delve in details and talk about everything that happened to Palestine from 1947 until today, from the partition plan until today. Nothing is self-evident. This was our main problem, I think. Also, the whole magic of the idea of rights and the weakness of it as well. Its magic is that rights seem to be above everything, but the problem is that it seems like there's constant compromise in rights, and they are subject to the balance of power and the interests of countries, and that has to do with the relations between countries. Therefore, there is fear. I'm ready to answer every single question that you pose, but I would like to finish by raising two points of concern with regard to human rights. I speak in the language of human rights always because, but don't forget also that politics is related to the language of rights. The first point of concern is that in order to succeed after 89 in the rhetoric of human rights and to be seen, yeah, as a victim, one must clearly be seen as a victim in order to succeed after 89 in the human rights thing. Someone's victimness, if you may, must be very clear before the whole world in order to receive support from the country. However, some parties wear the mask of a victim and try to show the other party as if they're not really a victim but an aggressor party, or whatever. Just like the moment of salvation, it seems like some parties think that if I appear as a victim, then the whole international community will help me. This is a very important point to consider, that it seems like victim mentality has been taken care. Two is the element of surprise. We are always surprised why no one can understand me. This is because we use the approach of self-evident. Nothing is self-evident. Only it is self-evident from your point of view. You're having the right, but it's not necessarily doing the right thing. God is above all; He can see everything from His point of view, but nothing is self-evident here. Um, I am willing to answer all of your questions. Just this question that I was asked to answer with regard to self-declaration. When I said that, I didn't mean a certain country over another. My main point was that countries should look at each other in the eyes and understand that self declaration is on the individual level is that I would have my personal space, and on the international level, it is the right to close my borders so that I cannot penetrate other countries. But there is the right of refugees. Refugees have the right to emigrate to wherever they want. But how can I? Yeah, so there is this kind of disagreement here. For example, in Israel, let us assume that the Jews have the right to self determination, and 90% of the world believe that the Jews have self determination. Let us assume. How can that go hand in hand with the right of return? You should compromise one of the human rights uh, principles on account of another. That's therefore the human rights would not give you the answer. You it seems that you would have to compromise one right over another. This is the twist or the dirt that I mean the whole thing about human rights. This is the paradigm that can have it all. But it seems like the political parties are under the uh, strugglers for human rights. It seems like the people calling for human rights are above the political level as well. This is what yeah, I would like to say with regard to the right to self determination. Let's say the Palestinian state was was established, and if the Palestinian state cannot take in all the refugees, uh, don't the Palestinians have the right of return to their lands, even within the 1967 borders or when the Palestinian state? Hagai El-Had did not have his citizenship or passport revoked. I doubt that highly. Rights, sorry, are a very complicated network. I agree with you, but the problem is that the more you look at its compli- complications, and here we're talking about proper proportionality, I look at different arguments. You have so many different points of view. Every side says something that could contradict the others. Every side saying something different. At the end, I must take a decision. And eventually, the decision should be based on my preferences. If I prefer the need over autonomy, then I would choose the need. But this is not related to the rights. This is more like a more of a moral sensitivity where the needs could be preferred over autonomy. I would like to give my dear fellow speakers to speak out. I am really sorry for not being able to answer all the questions. Dr. Raja and Asim will speak now and answer. But just a quick point, lunch is directly after this session. It will be at 12:30, and we will be um, back to session 2 at 1:45 as scheduled. And when you go to the lunch, the dear students from Birzeit University will show you the hall where lunch will take place. Dr. Raja, the questions, 3 or 4 questions that I heard were really interrelated, spoke about the same subject. So I would like to talk about it from a general point of view. I would like to discuss the general framework where we can look at the concept of rights from a universal point of view. There shouldn't be disputes on the human needs behind the rights. I think that everything that I said that I said goes hand in hand with the fulfillment of the necessary rights. There is, of course, competition between countries, between people, and so on. With regard to the rights and the needs of people and the nature of people, these subjects have been discussed by myself in several writings, publications, and works. This needs a long time to discuss. I cannot present this subject in a few minutes. I've written a lot about that. But to put it in a nutshell, this has to do with the right and the law. I think that the concept of the right emerged from the law, and the law is based on the rule, a set of customs that people adopted. Therefore, without the word we should, there could not be a right. The word should are as used when we play chess, when we play different games. You should uh, use the king, move the king, for example, while playing chess. You should. So the word should seems to be not very ethical at times. So the whole idea is that the word should is a cutting point in this. So the things that lead to rights and obligations eventually emerged from the people's social nature. Man is a social being, and so advancement and development and civilization emerged after the two main uh, natural instincts of people. One, the instinct of compassion, and the instinct of anger. Compassion, many times, prevents one from being silent if they see their brethren suffering from something. This instinct of compassion puts people in an empathetic position and does not allow his brethren to suffer. This is a very humanitarian thing. Even animals have that, the compassion of. to their kind. The second instinct is the instinct of anger, where people can be angry and deter and stand up against something. And this anger can later lead to respect for others. So, the ability of people to be compassionate and to be angry eventually lead to certain societal systems. Usually, for example, people do not steal from each other and do not lie to each other. For example, Donald Trump, who is addicted to lying, among the many sentences that people speak, you would see that the number of lies in one's speech are very, very few. This is not by coincidence. And that's because if we have compassion towards others, we wouldn't want to lie to them or steal from them and so on. And therefore, it is not strange that we see certain customs and customary things. Uh, that's why the whole idea of should emerges. You should do this. You should, and that's problematic. The development takes place in a natural way. A conflict is always there. Um, Also, imbalances take place, and we are very emotional. So, therefore, as a result, it is uh, absolutely true that humans have certain needs and rights, and these rights are conventions. No difference between chess principles and the rights principles. The only difference between the two is that if someone lives 1 year without playing chess, it would be okay. But if someone lives for 1 year without morality, two things can happen. One, you cannot really leave morality and ethics and rights. You can sometimes, for example, sell your car and get away from that obligation. But it is not possible for a society to keep functioning after 1 year from lying, constant lying or theft or even murder. You see what I mean? So, so these are public things. Rights are public. Someone cannot get away with that. Lying would not be of any use. So you have rights inside the society. Societies are changing and developing. There are basic rights and non-basic rights, but it seems like all of this is integrated. So things are crystal clear in this. If we live in the same country, it is quite clear that you would not come and attack me or steal from me in the normal situation. So that's what I meant. Just three main points to answer the questions, and I hope that you would not misunderstand me in giving a romantic image regarding constitutional courts and what have you. Um, so courts do not always say the truth. courts actually have been sometimes part of the hegemony of nations. So I didn't mean to romanticize the whole role of all courts. No. Second point is that there are important assumptions. The experiences related to the four assumptions had to do with different countries. Uh, but the most important thing is the independence of the judiciary. Without that, the courts will become a tool for oppression, undoubtedly so. So, higher courts have a very important role in maintaining human rights in order to also avoid second guessing. So the courts have the role to uh, say the truth, but citizens also have or must have a mechanism of defending themselves once again or appealing even. Um, as for the third point, the subject of my lecture had nothing to do with the state of emergency in the violation of laws and so on. The main objective was that rights should not be undermined when there is a state of emergency. In normal situations, even the rights are sometimes being abused or violated. Therefore, a balance of rights must be taken into consideration, and the society must also um, technically cherish and uphold the various considerations. You see what I mean? Things should not only be seen from the ethical point of view. Sometimes the public opinion is implementing. Sometimes there is a threat, but still, human rights must not be violated. Um, from this specific zoom, if you may, on human rights, um, we see that in different countries things are being dealt differently from the perspective of human rights. Despite the fact that human rights on the global level are based on the state institutions and the courts under certain societal aspects. Therefore, we must always look at the situation of human rights in every single country around or relevant country. Um, before closing this session, I would like to go back to Dr. Raif to ask him to answer an important question from a young lady here who asked, is there an alternative for the theory of human rights? That's what she asked. Do we have Fanon? Franz Fanon. And but even Fanon is an import, no? And therefore, um, well, everything outside of me is import. I don't believe that I should get rid of everything imported or I should be against the white man and so on. Hegemony is everywhere, not just by the white man. You can leave or run away from one hegemony only to find yourself under another hegemony. And so you should learn from all the hegemonies, if you may, or all the parties in order to eventually see get a balanced approach between the various parties. This is how I see it. But the idea of having something outside should be seen more positively. Let's leave our yes. So we even need to be liberated from the idea of liberation. This is how I finish. Thanks a lot. to the lecturers in this session. The lunch is in the lunch hall. The students from Birzeit University, some of them, will lead you to the hall. Bon appetit.